known from me over the past few months. My name is Natalie Wasik. I'm the Associate Director with 7th Generation, and I am just so honored and so happy that you're all able to join us tonight to celebrate 50 years of 7th Generation Interfaith. So thank you all. We have a wonderful panel, followed by a wonderful keynote, followed by a second wonderful panel. And so I just want to say a few thank yous and welcomes before we begin today. As you all know, SGI was started and founded 50 years ago by Father Mike Crosby, but not without the helping hands and the other foundresses that we also have to acknowledge. Both school sisters of St. Francis, Sister Alfonso Pulse, and Sister Charlita Foxhoven, who will be joining us tonight as well. So if you see Sister Charlita walking around or here, she definitely is a huge helping hand to the start of SGI. So again, I want to thank all of our sponsors, our attendees, and also all of the helping hands that went into putting tonight on. So the conference committee, as well as the board and staff, Executive Director Chris Cox and Christina Durrett, as staff as well. So thank you all for helping to put this night together, and welcome, and I'm very excited for what we have for the rest of the night planned out. And I'll introduce Cindy Boland, who is the SGI board chair.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. As Natalie said, my name is Cindy Boland. I'm the Director of Responsible Investing and Chief Mindfulness Officer at River Water Partners. And I do have the honor to serve as the current president of SGI's Board of Directors. I'm really pleased to welcome all of you to the 2023 SGI conference, celebrating 50 years the evolution of responsible investing. As kind of a newish responsible investment firm, River Water has very much appreciated its membership in SGI to inform our responsible investment practice. Today, you'll hear from longtime SGI members and current thought leaders in responsible investing, including Tim Smith, our keynote. And while responsible investing takes many forms today, what really strikes me is that the members of SGI have known all along that prosperity for all depends on resilient people and community. They have forever remained true to SGI's mission through the lens of faith and the promotion of human rights. 7th Generation Interfaith built a more just and sustainable world for those most vulnerable by integrating social and environmental values into corporate and investment actions. So tonight, I want to thank the sponsors who fund our work. These include sponsors of tonight's conference, most of you, and you're included in the program, and our members who pay annual dues to support this work. I'd also like to thank the current SGI team who leads our collective efforts in corporate stewardship. Chris Cox, our Executive Director, Natalie Wasik, our Associate Director, and Christina Dorette, our Shareholder Advocacy Manager. I'd like to particularly thank our Board of Directors who generally offer their time and talent to provide guidance for this important work and really genuinely enjoy working. Thank you to St. Francis Parish for hosting us. And finally, thank you to all of you for your interesting partnership. I hope you enjoyed the evening. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Carlson for the reflection.
I think for a lot of people here, it probably doesn't need an introduction, but Father Dan Crosby, Father Mike's big brother.
Well, it is, as you can imagine, it is a tremendous joy and privilege for me to be here on this 50th anniversary of 7th Generation. I thank Chris for inviting me to share this reflection and prayer. I knew this guy, you know, when he first came at Mike's hiring, right? When he had his office in this tiny little bedroom at St. Benedict's, right? And that stayed that way for a few years, didn't it? But he's graduated from that little tiny bedroom, and we're so proud of him, elevating, you know, making himself someplace, right? Great, thank you very much. Well, I thought I was being just asked to give the prayer, but the roster says reflection also, and that's what I was going to do anyway. So, I mean, that's kind of like Mike too, you know, you don't miss an opportunity to talk, you know, when you're given it. So anyway, my brother, Father Mike Crosby, was one of 3 founders, as we all know, but need to acknowledge, of this historic coalition. There's a good number of school sisters of St. Francis who are here today, and deservedly so for many reasons, including the kinship with Sister Alfonso and Sister Charlita, who were the other 2 with Mike that founded this coalition 50 years ago. I always admired Sister Alfonso. I never really had the privilege of knowing Sister Charlita. And I know that both Alfonso and Charlita would admit and joyfully admit that even though the 3 of them were the co-founders, that Mike in time was the mover and shaker and guider of this coalition. And we are grateful for that. I recently came across an article Mike wrote for National Catholic Reporter, along with an Ignatian sister who is here, Sister, where are you anyway? Diane Brigid. She and he right there kind of wrote a sequence of articles in National Catholic Reporter. And this was just months before Mike died. Mike died in August of 2017. And this article in National Catholic Reporter was written in the fall of 2016. I had never seen it. And it really serves what it says and shares. It really serves as a kind of a testament of all of Mike's work. He was reflecting on the Second Synod of Bishops, which met in Rome after Vatican II in June 1971. That's an important date, June 1971, because this coalition was founded 2 years later, right? So as I was reading this article, it really helped to put this coalition in context, okay? And I'm happy to share this with you. That Synod of Bishops, June 1971, produced a document that is entitled Justice in the World. And it strongly states action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world appear to us as an absolutely essential dimension. The actual word that they use is constitutive, but we never use that word. So an absolutely essential dimension of the proclamation of the gospel, which is the church's mission for the redemption of the human race and its liberation from every oppressive situation. That's the document, Justice in the World, June 1971. In his NCR article, Mike says that this document became, and I quote, the most formative text in my experience and work, unquote. After reflecting long and deeply on that document, that text, he says he told himself, and I quote, "You have to bring good news to those who are poor. This means solidarity with those who are poor because they struggle for justice." He remembers telling himself that and quoting it in this article, and then he says, my life since then has been an effort to realize this promise. The promise to bring good news to those who are poor. Solidarity with those who are poor because they struggle for justice. And to know that in doing this, he is doing what Christ and the church are meant to do, absolute essentials. Well, all of us are gathered here this afternoon to celebrate the fact that helping to found and then guide this seventh generation coalition was not only an important part of Mike's promise, it has become part of his lasting legacy. For as the mission statement of the seventh generation says, this is a coalition of faith-driven, values-driven institutional investors who attempt to build a more just and sustainable world for those most vulnerable. It is the impact on people, especially economically vulnerable people, which inspires us to act. And so let us pray. Loving Creator God, our scriptures tell us that you take delight in your people. This makes us know that you share our joy today as we remember the three faith-filled people who began this coalition, so that this world of ours might become more like the kingdom of God, which your son Jesus came to bring about. He suffered, died, and rose again to make it a living, lasting reality. We praise you for Alfonso, Charlita, and Mike, and the many, many others in the course of these 50 years who have caught the same gospel vision and have struggled and suffered in their own lives to make that vision real and lasting for themselves and others, especially those whose voices are not heard or considered important. What delight you have as you look at them. For in each of them, you see the loving, compassionate face of your son, Jesus. Loving Creator God, may you continue to take equal delight in us gathered here today. Help us to be people who not only fondly remember these gospel people, but people who listen to and respond to the same call to become disciples who courageously put our own faith into action. Disciples who live not just for ourselves and our comfort, but for all our brothers and sisters, especially those who are weak and vulnerable and who suffer discrimination and other forms of fear and violence. With your constant grace-filled support and the inspiration of the brothers and sisters we remember today, may we all work to make our communities, our world, our church, to be a little bit more like your kingdom, a little bit more like the world you take delight in. And we ask you this through Jesus Christ our Lord, who is alive and rules with you forever and ever. Amen. Well, that wasn't a very strong amen. Who lives and reigns with you forever and ever. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Nathan. And I'll just point out that Sister Charlita has arrived now. If you'll just raise your hand, sister. We're so glad to have you with us tonight. And I'll ask then our 4 panelists who are SGI members, please to come forward, so that we're going to start with kind of then looking back through some of these past 50 years, some of the engagements we have. So some early members in the work, our organizations that are early in the work, will share some stories and reflections. And I'll ask, their bios are in the program, so you can read it there, but they can make a short introduction. Who will take the mic first?
Good evening. My name is Sister Barbara Jennings. I work with the Interfaith Coalition of Responsible Investment in St. Louis. Sort of retired right now, but we are still fairly active in St. Louis and keeping up with SGI and all of the activities. So just a little bit of history, and I will bring in Father Mike on this too, that my first introduction to socially responsible investment was in the late 19.
The microphone's bad, not sisters.
1975, when I heard the stories of the sisters and brothers in St. Louis, I was living in Kansas City then. They were beginning to file shareholder resolutions with McDonnell Douglas, which is now Boeing Company. They were asking McDonnell Douglas to stop making military weapons for use in Vietnam and to instead continue making commercial planes, products, etc. At these first meetings of McDonnell Douglas in St. Louis, the women and men were searched by military personnel. They were booed at the annual meeting, and they were considered renegade sisters, those post-Vatican II people. And what were they doing? Telling us, a huge conglomerate airline company, war company, what to do. Another factor in the beginning of the Midwest Coalition was the South African Krugerrands. And the sisters and the priests and brothers in St. Louis, they formed little teams. They, with their leaders, etc., they picked out a bank to go to in St. Louis, Boatman's Bank, National Bank, etc., to present their case about selling Krugerrands, which was upholding the government of South Africa in the 70s. They were warning our banks and other companies to say, you got to get out of this. Look at the social unrest that you are backing up with money. You are selling these like crazy in the United States. But we know that in the end, these banks did give up selling the Krugerrands in St. Louis. And we know what happened in South Africa in the late 70s also with the uprisings and the riots. And many of our US companies had to leave or at least shut down for a time. GM, Ford, HP, were all over there and benefiting, but not from the labor of the native people. So the sisters that were first involved in forming the Midwest Coalition was a Loretto sister, Marianne McGivern, and Susan Jordan, a Notre Dame sister. They were the first directors, and they carried out the mission with creativity, intelligence, determination, and passion. When I came on the director job in 2007, I inherited not only this local group of sisters, Marianists, Jesuits, etc. We're all members by this time. I inherited this great local group, but also the work of ICCR, which had also burgeoned and blossomed and become a great organization by the mid-2000s. So we work together with our groups, with other CRI groups, coalitions throughout our country. There is a CRI in San Antonio, New Jersey, Wisconsin, etc. And then, of course, I met Father Mike Crosby at these ICCR meetings and learned even more about the cigarette and problems selling cigarettes to children in third world countries, as well as sometimes at home. I learned more about the Nestle infant formula dialogues that went on through Michael Crosby. I have read his book, The Spirituality of the Beatitudes, and I would recommend that if you have not read this, because it does give you the background for why do we as a church pursue social justice. So Midwest Coalition, we continued our local relationships with companies. We continued going to Boeing to talk about weapon systems. We went to Monsanto to talk about genetically modified products, our local utility, Arch Coal, and well, I guess that's it. So we found that pursuing our corporations within our own locale was very fruitful because people respected the sisters. St. Louis, pretty Catholic, and lots of the CEOs, et cetera, had been educated at Catholic schools. So we did work with our corporations. One year we actually won a vote at Ameren, which is our energy utility, 51% of the vote. So that was a good shot in the arm for all of us. We continued to dialogue with Ameren. They, as well as all of our companies that we worked with, agreed to do the CDP questionnaire, the Carbon Disclosure Project questionnaire. These kinds of things helped us so much. They were good tools for the company to report. How much water are we using? How much oil? What are we, what's our supply chain like? How much oil comes through there? What is there any slavery down there at the bottom of the pits? Literally. Well, Boeing agreed to do that for us. They hired a company to work all the way down almost to the pits in Africa with the 4 minerals that are used in airplanes, etc. That they did find that they were having some slave labor over there in Africa with cobalt, tin, gold, and there's another one. Yeah, titanium. So this work is detailed and it's persistent, and I gotta hurry on. So 7th Generation, when the time came, was just the organization that we needed to continue our work, because some of the sisters groups, the Jesuits joined another group. It's the Marianists went to Texas, they left St. Louis. So we were scrambling around. So what we again learned, promoting dialogues that are well prepared, fruitful, respecting the need to report and to remedy their situations. Respect was the main word. We went to these meetings, we didn't yell and scream at Monsanto, which some people did, but they listened to us. So I learned a lot from Michael Crosby in Action at Boeing and ICCR meetings. And just to finish, the idea about Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, you remember, became Boeing. Those meetings moved to Chicago, the shareholder meetings. And instead of booing us and having search dogs when we came in the room, the meetings turned around in the mid-2000s. They came out to greet us in the lobby at the meetings were held at the Natural Museum of History in Chicago. They came out to greet us, the guard dogs disappeared, even the wands, making sure we don't have a weapon, disappeared, and the CEOs and the board would come out to meet us, and they did do their work on their supply chain. So I believe that the present pushback on ESG, which we have mentioned, are from some investors and politicians, is a sign of our persistence and our success. Why would some investors and trade groups push back if we were not successful? All of us, members of staff and SGI, continue to be knowledgeable, involved, in producing results that make corporations publish results, and we had fun.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tim Dewane. I'm the director of Shalom, the Office of the School Sisters of Notre Dame for Justice, Peace, and Care of Our Common Home. Unlike Barb, for whom this was a full-time endeavor, this was a small portion of my job, like 5%. But even when it's not your main job, you can get involved in incredible ways that you never imagined, especially if your first week of work, you're introduced to Father Mike Crosby. In 25 years ago this summer. And they say, Tim, we want you to meet Father Mike Crosby. He's going to explain to you something called corporate responsibility and shareholder engagement. And you're going to represent the School Sisters of Notre Dame at that time in the Milwaukee area about it. As you heard, we have School Sisters of Notre Dame who were a long time involved in St. Louis. Little did I know, within a few years, I would be addressing Rex Tillerson and the board of directors of ExxonMobil in the Symphony Center in Dallas, challenging them ever so politely that it's in their business best interest to take into account not only the issue of malaria in sub-Saharan Africa, but also HIV/AIDS. It was in their bottom line best interest. And little did we know, of course, they brought in a Harvard expert to explain this was outside of the fence, something they didn't need to get involved with. But like many of our corporate engagements, within a year and a half, they changed their policy of their own thinking. It had no real engagement by the investors. Little did I know that in a couple years, I would be addressing GE's annual meeting, at that time, the largest corporation in the world, and challenging them about this little fact that while the ratio of the CEO pay to the average worker used to be 30 times, then it was 50 times, then it was 100 times, in the early 2000s, see if this sounds familiar, it was over 400%. And is that really in the enlightened best interest of our company going forward? Now that one we didn't make as much success on, but it was for the School Sisters of Notre Dame. It wasn't so much the long-term engagements that you had in St. Louis. Up here in Wisconsin, it was a scattershot of engagements wherever we were needed. If Mike needed someone related to tobacco, we held tobacco stop. If Mike needed someone related to climate change or other issues, we held ExxonMobil and other oil companies. When Mike called, we responded. And it's amazing, the issues we involved in: labor standards, vendor standards, military contractors, environmental concerns, packaging, HIV, violence in video games, racial equity, tobacco use, impact on employers, on and on. Usually we were the supportive voice, but occasionally we were asked to step up and be the lead voice. And those were important times. And Mike in the early days did his best to support us, as did ICCR. But as seventh generation came around and our collaboration with other groups, we no longer had to worry about being the experts. And what a blessing that is for us, for whom this isn't our full-time occupation. We could be the simple, constant, moral voice. So is this in our bottom line best interest? And how can we reflect care for our common home and people and still make a profit? And it makes a big difference. For the School Sisters of Notre Dame, who believe in walking the gospel to the best of their ability and all they can do, it includes doing that with their finances. And we think dialogue is definitely the way to go, as is collaboration. And we're so glad it's not simply a small group of Catholic organizations or other faith-based investors now, but it goes beyond that to have a large moral voice. So we're very excited about it. I had no idea when I walked with Father Mike that first week at Marquette University, I think ICCR was meeting there that summer, that what I would get involved in, but it was an incredible journey. And I am very thankful to be a part of it.
Good evening. My name is Sister Mary Brigid Clingman, and I'm a member of the Dominican Sisters in Grand Rapids, which I think is one of the newest members of SGI. Are we still the youngest?
Among them, yeah.
Okay. We originally belonged to CRIM, the Coalition for Corporate Responsibility for Indiana and Michigan. There were 9 mother houses in that LCWR region. That group existed for about 25 years, actively involved in dialogues and local programs when we had a staff person to empower us. Over the years, the diminishment, mergers, loss of members to Mercy Investment and others forced the decision to disband. Our congregation then opted to join SGI, and I became the liaison person for them. I am the promoter of justice for our congregation and am responsible for the empowerment, education, and programming and the like for our sisters, associates, and friends, a mailing list of about 500, in 5 different justice issues: care of creation, immigration, human trafficking, peace and security of all, and economic justice. You have the same list?
Yeah, I think so.
So I don't know if he is, but I'm a jack of all trades and master of none. I personally became involved in investment ministry when I was on our leadership team in 2000 and began attending CRIM and ICCR meetings, but did very little activity beyond our proxy voting. Several times, I represented East Coast-based filers at AGMs, since my drive time to meetings was 15 minutes as compared, or 15 miles compared to 750. I was rewarded at Kellogg's when I was representing the New York Firemen's Pension Fund with a large dirty box of goodies, which converted to a lovely art supply box, which has ended up at St. Bonaventure Monastery in Detroit. On the other hand, when I presented for Boston Trust Walden, I was branded by one of our parishioners, board member of Gentrex, as a communist. Thank you, Tim. When we joined 7th Generation, I let the staff know that this was a fairly small aspect of my justice ministry. I would be highly reliant on them to tell me what to do, and I would cooperate. Yeah. Their response is such that I'm now a board member, have tripled the number of our co-filings, and have been thoroughly educated a few times a month through webinars from here and from ICCR. All of this during COVID, the sale of our mother house, the movement of all of our sisters and offices to new facilities, the introduction of Laudato Si action plan, et cetera, and so forth. One of the foundational aspects of Laudato Si is that of integral ecology, that we are all connected one to another. That reality bore fruit in the webbing tissues of corporate responsibility and human trafficking. I am on their education committee and have developed some educational modules for them, one of which was concerned with the intersectionality of human trafficking and corporate responsible investment. I developed a PowerPoint presentation for a webinar, which was then presented by Sister Kathleen Cole, Sister of St. Joseph, an active member of ICCR. Our congregation has been supportive of our investment mission over many years out of our commitment to social justice and systemic change. While much of our activity may be of mustard seed quality, the roots are old and deep, if not always dramatic. One of our grand economic decisions was to create a trust fund to provide a living wage for our employees. This was an action that once landed me in a hot spot with Mike Crosby. When I was involved in jail prison ministry back in the 80s and 90s, I had a deep working relationship with the Capuchins in Detroit, but not so much with the Wisconsin group. Obviously, at ICCR, I knew of Mike, but I had never really encountered him. But at one of the meetings, I was in a small group with him talking about wages. I don't recall what I said about minimum wages, but in a sudden moment, I was being berated by this man because I should have known better, as my congregation had spearheaded the living wage movement. I'm not sure how the conversation had jumped from minimum wage to living wage. And I was less sure of how this man knew who I was and where I came from. One of the sustaining aspects of this and of any ministry is the reality of the cloud of witnesses that both propel and ground us to be the faithful and responsive to continuing the walk. In my journey, I remember with gratitude such persons as George Hartwell, Gordon Judd, Margie Weber, Pat Daly, Ruth Rosenbaum, Carol Nugent, and many others who are inviting, encouraging, challenging, and walked with me to this moment. We each have such a litany, and to them, to all of them, we say thank you.
Good evening, I'm Dan Tretow. I represent the School Sisters of St. Francis for a good number of years. I didn't know if that musical interlude was your time's up, we should move on. But I want to give you a few thoughts and a few historical moments. 50 years ago, October 27th of 1973, there was a Milwaukee Journal article titled "7 Groups Unite on Investments." The article stated 7 religious communities based in Wisconsin have formed a coalition for corporate responsibility through church investments. The action was taken at a meeting in Madison sponsored by the Milwaukee Justice and Peace Center and the Wisconsin Leadership Conference of Women Religious. Organizations involved are the Eau Claire Benedictines, the Generate of the School Sisters of St. Francis, the Midwest Province of the Capuchin Franciscans, the Sisters of the Divine Savior, the Sisters of St. Joseph, Stevens Point, the Society of Mary, and the Society of the Divine Savior. So in the early years, it wasn't a place for a religious to go to a corporation to say anything that would be meaningful or forthcoming to, make a point. And so some of their thoughts may have been, why are they here? What are you asking that for? And this is none of your business. So in 1974, February 1st, Tracy Early from the North American Newspaper Alliance wrote, "Despite crushing defeats in past years, churches in the corporate responsibility movement are getting set to fight another round of battles this spring. The movement is growing and the number of resolutions being filed exceeds that of any previous year. And to bring you 50 years forward, that mission and statement is still true. More and more resolutions are being brought forward by the faith-based groups." And then again in 1974, May 4th, there was a Milwaukee Sentinel article that said, "If you first don't succeed, stating, David lost to Goliath this week. David was the Corporate Responsibility Action Group, which this was the Wisconsin Coalition at the time, representing 18 Roman Catholic religious orders. And Goliath was IBM. Sister Charlita was at that meeting. And when I spoke with her about this, she said, I was all set to speak. We were there to present the resolution. There was this gadfly, and that was her nickname. You know her name, Tim? Evelyn Davis. Evelyn Davis. Took so much time that Sister Charlita never got the opportunity to say what she wanted to. But that was the meeting where Goliath won, David lost. And that's the experience that we started out with. And so I think when you look at the 50 years, and just in my experience, I worked with a retailer in Wisconsin who we met with biannually just to try and help them improve their social status, their corporate responsibility. Some of our work was tied around how are you treating your employees? And this company was getting bigger and bigger as time went on. And the employee supply chain was no longer in the United States. It went overseas to where the cheapest work could be found at the cheapest price. So we met with them. This was David Schilling from ICCR, Mike, the School Sisters of Notre Dame, the Racine Dominicans. Any others that you remember? Just all Wisconsin groups, because they're a Wisconsin corporation. And we got to the point where we, I think, directed them to gather documentation and support for the group that was working outside in those vendor manufacturing plants. And the whole thing was, we fortified their terms of engagement. That's the document that they use. They post on the walls of the factory. It's supposed to be in the language of the local community so that they can read it and understand it. We asked a lot of questions about how is that translated? I mean, do you read it to them? Do you have workshops? Do you have third-party groups that come in and explain what these terms mean? And I think we did a good job at that. And we continue to meet with them on other things. And over time, our meetings got more interesting. Like at the beginning, we brought, and it was the Wisconsin groups again, sponsored a maquiladora to come to an annual meeting at this retailer. And they were upset. And why would we dare do that? And they don't want their associates to hear what is happening in that local community. And the next year, I think we started seeing people with earbuds and talking into wrists. And it was a much more secure setting. And I didn't feel good about where it was going. And we continued to meet that way. And then as time went by, and let's advance 50 years, now it's an online meeting. And you're lucky if you get 2 minutes to say anything or to raise any issue. And for them, all of the issues had to be brought forward well in advance so that we could talk through it and end up with a withdrawal out of our dialogue. I think we filed twice over the 10 or 15 years that we were working together. And each time they were very upset. It's like, we've been meeting with you for all this time. Why do you want to, put us out there in a bad light? And the resolutions did make it to their proxy, and they were voted on. And I don't think that we had the restriction now of going forward with so many percent of the vote, but we were persistent. And we continue to work, well, up until just recently. COVID did take a kind of a downturn in that activity, but it's still a company that I think we need to work with. And that's the best part about being in the SGI. We know it's a long term, it's a long a battle. And we want to make sure that when we both see a benefit from our work together, then it's worthwhile, it's enriching, and we can move forward on to the next thing. So I appreciate SGI, its current leadership, and all of you for supporting SGI, your membership, your persistence at keeping doggedly after those corporations to be better corporate citizens. So thank you very much.
Step back. Thank you all. And why don't I'll let you guys take your seats. If you're wondering about, for instance, which corporation Dan was referring to, actually, there's a historical document on the table over there. The first resolution he filed with that company and some of the antecedents. Also along the tables over there, you'll find a copy of the first resolution regarding climate change filed with any U.S. corporation Father Mike filed. And a number of other historic documents that are quite telling. Somebody who shows up in some of those historic documents and the like is a gentleman by the name of Tim Smith, who has his biography is in there. But I'll just say that Miles Davis once said that a legend is a man with a cane that people talk about what he used to do. That word then can't really apply to Tim because he's still doing it. And with that, let me just pass the microphone to Tim so that he can.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's so very special to be with you this afternoon, to be able to be part of this celebration and be able to channel the spirit of Mike Crosby and Sister Carlita and Sister Alfonso in the early days that you helped create something new and different and daring and impactful. So it is a pleasure to be part of you today and to be invited to address you this afternoon and to follow such a great panel telling these wonderful stories of not just the early days, but the ongoing ministry that you championed. So ICCR recently had its 50th anniversary and did a 50-year look back at decade by decade, what some of the achievements were, the memorable events, the challenges. And that was a very memorable experience as well, especially for me since I was president, the first staff person at ICCR in the early days. So I really appreciate that it is a very big deal to stop today, to pause, to celebrate 5 decades of impactful history and recent achievements, as well as the good old days, as we heard in the last panel. 50 years ago, this coalition and ICCR helped make, I think, history in the faith community when we joined forces in an interfaith effort to address the corporate social responsibility and the affairs of corporations. So I think it is important when Protestants and Roman Catholics, and now the Jewish community, Muslims, and others join together in a common ministry. In those days, we were joining our common passion for justice and our commitment to be faithful stewards of God's plan. But this was combined not just with a moral voice, but with our finances, including our investment portfolio, a very new and different approach. In those early days, 5 decades ago, there was no roadmap, no game plan, no experience to build on for this work. Rather, ICCR's statement, as Josh knows well, is inspired by faith, committed to action. That's our roadmap, if you will, over the years. And that was our guide in those early days too. As the statement goes, we built the plane as we flew it. We learned as we went. Well, many of you may know ICCR was created in 1971 by 6 Protestant denominations, who soon thereafter were approached by Mike Crosby. I can remember meetings at 475 Riverside Drive, the Interchurch Center, as Mike came in and shared this great vision he had about making this an interfaith ministry, advocating corporate social responsibility to business. Now, Mike also didn't come with a roadmap, but he did come with a vision, a passion to advance our mission, and a willingness to join forces with what I'll call other prophetic fools to challenge some of the largest institutions of our time, the transnational corporations. Whether that was Exxon or Nestle or Philip Morris. Now that was sort of a brave and for some considered a foolish enterprise to be challenging these major institutions of wealth and power. Of course, this prophetic voice was not always welcome, probably mostly unwelcome in the boardrooms and stockholder meetings that we heard about a little earlier. But it was heard, and it did plant seeds, and we did see those changes. Sister Barbara made the dramatic example from the guard dogs and the wands changing to a sense of respect and understanding. Yes, you have a right to be here. We need to listen. You're raising some of the issues of the day that are so important for us. So Mike and the early coalition members, Sister Carlita can remember this well, were willing to take risks, stepping into unknown issues and working with strategies that were novel, like corporate dialogues, shareholder resolutions. That was not a comfortable task. It wasn't something that said, oh yeah, we know how to do that. We'll go ahead. What were some of the early issues that we addressed? Well, you heard some of them. One of the first issues was the whole question of apartheid in South Africa. The entrenched system of racial injustice that was called apartheid. And we called on banks and companies to end their support for that government and those laws. The Episcopal Church made history in 1971 when they filed the first shareholder resolution on South Africa with General Motors and called on GM to exit from South Africa. The presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church attended that stockholders meeting, made a strong and passionate plea, and received about a 3% vote, but got about a front page headline and story in the New York Times. So this was a time of witnessing truth to power. And Reverend Spalding, who's going to be on the next panel, is now on the committee that launched those early resolutions. After the GM resolution, literally scores and scores of companies were facing resolutions calling for them to withdraw their business from the land of apartheid. This was an outrageous demand at that point, but one that members of the coalition embraced, participated in, and it led to 20 years of engagements with companies. And as you heard, well over 100 companies did leave South Africa, facing not just shareholder resolutions and the sisters who went to stockholders meetings or the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, but facing grassroots pressure from the Black community, students, boycotts, demonstrations. It became an issue of the day that companies, many of them, felt it in their best interest to withdraw. Lesson one then was the endurance of the long distance runner was necessary to do this work. Don't expect easy, quick, simple victories. Recognize that you need to be in the long haul, and as we heard on the earlier panel, persistence and perseverance and all. Now, how do we know this work made a difference? Well, we had Archbishop Tutu, the Anglican Archbishop of South Cape Town, and President Nelson Mandela, when they came to the United States, they paid tribute to those who helped ease this economic pressure on South Africa. And they testified that that pressure was a key ingredient leading to negotiations with the government and the Black majority and was a leading agreement leading to peaceful change and transfer of power. A very significant early event in our common life. Sister Barbara mentioned the sale of the South African gold for the Kruger Rand. That was part of it, but there were calls on banks to stop lending to the government as well as companies to withdraw. Banks were, and in the early days, said to us very simply, you're asking us not to make a loan on moral grounds. That's not how banking works. We will make a loan if it's a reasonable risk, if we'll be paid off and paid interest. You're asking us to make a decision based on an entirely different set of criteria. And that was correct. We were actually speaking a different language, like ships passing in the night. But interestingly enough, a figure as major as David Rockefeller, who was the head of Chase Manhattan Bank, was also a very active Baptist. And he felt it was wrong to have his bank's money being loaned to a government that was acting in such a racist and reprehensible way. And he pulled the plug, and others didn't follow. But let's turn to a second issue from the early days that you all participated in, and you heard reference to it too, the baby formula campaign. So this was a campaign where many organizations participated and built a very large and global coalition. But we were focusing, as you probably know, on practices of US companies, but also the global Swiss giant Nestle, as they were promoting and selling baby formula in developing countries as the best way to feed infants. Better, they were arguing, than breastfeeding, which was in fact the much superior feed for babies and for their health. And as we also probably know, when that baby formula was quite expensive, and when you mixed it with polluted water, it became a formula for malnutrition, sickness, and unfortunately the death of many children. So this became a global campaign. It included shareholder resolutions. It included a boycott of Nestle products. And it had support from such a wide range of organizations, from women's organizations to the faith community, health professionals, educators, unions, and the list goes on. And one ICCR leader, the Sisters of the Precious Blood of Ohio, actually sued Bristol-Myers Squibb, arguing that their proxy statement was false and misleading as it characterized the benefits of baby formula and ignored the problems, and they won. And we had a meeting with the board of Bristol-Myers Squibb, and they wound up making some major changes in their practices so that they would not improperly market this formula. There were other dramatic results too of this campaign. And the World Health Organization and UNICEF championed it. They understood the issue full well. And there began to be pressure internationally for a code of conduct to govern baby formula marketing and promotion. That was passed at a World Health Organization meeting, but every country in the world voted for it, except the United States under President Reagan, who saw it as a form of international socialism that he opposed. But this was a tremendous example of the faith community planting some seeds in the early days that helped grow into a global campaign where we're not the only voices, but we were present and front and center at the table as we negotiated the final agreement with Nestle to end the boycott. But let's not spend all our time looking back over 30, 40 years. Let's jump forward to see right now how this ministry continues under the 7th generation and ICCR. So, as you well know, when you read 7th generation's reports on ICCR's website, currently this community is addressing a number of current issues affecting business and the investment community. Still continues work on tobacco abuse, working hard on climate change, political spending and lobbying, drug pricing, and many, many more. So those reports are something that you can be proud of because they're a testimony to the work we've done. So our common ministry has evolved, the issues have broadened, our strategies and approaches have become more sophisticated, as is our understanding of the economic system in which we operate. And that's very important to understand, that we're not just addressing individual companies on issues, we're trying to create or be a precipitating force for systemic change. But it's also fair to say that we do our work today, Seventh Generation does, in a very different context than we did in the past. There are different actors, players, and the context is evolved. So let me give you some examples. So you remember we talked about the pioneers of the early days, a few shares and a prophetic voice, and we stood firm and engaged companies. Well, today we also work in an environment where globally investors have joined the Principles for Responsible Investing, PRI, and are arguing that these environmental, social, governance issues, ESG as they call them, must be addressed because they affect companies' financial bottom lines. PRI has investors globally with $120 trillion with a T of assets under management. That's a different context than when we started out, isn't it? And we've been part of a series where Reverend Spalding's going to speak from was such a key role in creating Climate 100 Plus, a global coalition of investors addressing companies on a set of common demands about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and addressing climate change. And if I'm right, that coalition, Climate 100 Plus, has well over $60 trillion, right, of assets under management. That's an exciting, different context too. And you'll hear Josh Dinner talk about the fact that ICCR members, religious and state, some investment managers now have investments of $4 trillion of asset under management. So these represent new players, state and city pension funds, New York City, New York State, California teachers, California Public Employees Retirement System, investment managers, foundations, some trade unions, individuals filing resolutions and with some real success, and nonprofit organizations joining in this new era that we're in. We also are watching votes on our resolutions change. The early days, we celebrated if we got a 5% vote. Now we're regularly seeing votes in the 25% to 60% range. And a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, we thought 37 companies get votes of over 50%. This year, we need to report that unfortunately votes declined under the pressure we'll talk about in a minute. But nonetheless, resolutions still play a key role in engaging boards and top management to look at the issues of the day. What's a second thing we can be encouraged by and watch? It's the engagements and resolutions that we filed having such an impact that I think at ICCR, Josh, last year, a third of our resolutions were withdrawn because of a changing because we changed company policies and practices and disclosure. So it was a mutual agreement that led to a withdrawal of the resolution. So this reminds us that we move from being prophets outside the gate to sometimes, not always, being a respected voice in the boardroom. That's worth celebrating. Here's another factor that I think is worthy. Some people might disagree with this description, but I think a lot of companies get it. A lot of companies we now talk to about climate change and diversity and human rights, etc., instead of resisting the call to pay attention to these issues, say that they understand that they are important for shareholder value. And so it becomes a discussion not whether they should address those issues, but how they should address them. ICCR is about to publish a list of quotes from various companies on their commitment to sustainability. Now, we know we need to keep taking those value statements and encouraging the companies to live by them. But it is important that we can say that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of major companies in the United States and global understand that sustainability and corporate social responsibility are part of who they are, and they embrace it. So I think that's an important thing to celebrate too, the change in business attitude. Now, we should not pretend that we take credit for all these changes. Of course not. There's so many factors that make companies make this shift from consumers to employees. But we should pause and say it's no small part to the relentless witness of the faith community. We play a role. Other factors we look at are things like public policy changes. We expect the Securities Exchange Commission to come out this fall with some new guidelines on climate change or on human capital. And Kirsten will mention, I'm sure, a vote yesterday in California that requires companies to disclose new information on climate. How important is it, right? When companies recognize the rules of the road are changing, and what we were asking to do now will become the norm for all companies. So I'm going to move into a different focus here, because let's look at what are as a new wave of challenges that we all face in this world. No surprise to any of you in this room, but we now live in a country where there is a huge polarized debate on so many issues, right? And unfortunately, corporate social responsibility and what is called ESG investing is now into crosshairs. It is described as critics variously as woke, a leftist activist agenda, an attempt to destroy the free enterprise system, and even by one politician called the work of Satan. Does that describe your work, Barbara? Pretty good. Yeah. These are not just harsh words of criticism, however, though, right? They're funded with literally over $1 billion of backing now, and a new political energy from conservative critics who want to discredit our work, but they also are putting huge economic muscle behind opposing. I am not trying to be political here or an alarmist, but it's important that we're aware that every issue that ICCR and seventh generation members work on is under attack, as is our ability to file resolutions to raise the issues we want with companies. This is a discouraging moment in our 50-year history, right? It is a time to celebrate, but it's a time to realistically see what's in danger. So I'm going to finish with some headlines to help make this point. 32 states had bills presented attacking ESG investing. Some passed in a dozen states. And this is obviously discouraging to watch state by state legislators say that their pension funds shouldn't be able to take into account common sense issues like climate change or diversity. July was anti-ESG month in the House of Representatives, as I believe there were 8 hearings attacking ESG investing. And that led up to marking about over a dozen bills in the House, federal bills, will put restrictions on this work. Now, we don't know if there's going to be any votes on these in Congress, because Congress needs to pass the budget and keep the economy running. But it's truly worrisome that so many legislators spent quality time addressing ESG investing as if it was a major enemy. Thirdly, attack on the SEC as it tries to come out with its climate change policy, and threats by groups to file court cases to block that policy if it's passed. And then legal actions. subpoenas to Series and other organizations demanding information and actually mentioning the very good work of Seventh Generation and its members. And finally, as we all know, in the presidential race, we see a number of candidates who have decided to champion anti-ESG work and action against woke companies. So the list goes on, from court cases to other actions, but it is depressing to see this growing. We are vigorously involved at ICCR in pushing back, having created civic organizations and investor coalition to push back. We expect in the fall, we will need to reach out to all of you and ask you for letters and signing statements and maybe, taking action to try to preserve our rights, writing the SEC and others. We'll certainly, you can rely on us to create those models along with the Seventh Generation staff. But we would also urge you to encourage your asset managers, the people that work for you, to manage your portfolios, to be actively involved in voting for the resolutions that you sponsor and that you support. And this is so important because these managers are under considerable attack by conservative organizations. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, to mention a few. And they have said to us, gee, we need to hear from our clients who support this work rather than just hearing from those who are attacking us. BlackRock itself has had $4 billion in business pulled from it because of its voting record and supposedly its woke positions. So our voice as clients and as investors needs to be heard. Our managers need to hear from us. We, of course, would continue to encourage in this fall proxy season that we all stand up and we are continue to actively join in filing and co-filing resolutions to keep our voice and vote heard in company boardrooms and in the public. Well, there's lots more to say, but not enough time to say it. And much more wisdom awaits on the next panel. So let me finish with a heartfelt thanks for being here, to be able to celebrate with you, to feel your support and energy, and to be able to channel the spirit of Seventh Generation, its founders, and leaders like Mike Crosby. Blessings on you as you prepare for this next decade. Thank you.
That was really extraordinary. Maybe I'll ask our panel to come up and we will move expeditious. Where do you this might be best. I'll just echo the thanks. It's really a great thing for me, a great joy to be able to be here with you all and have this opportunity to have a conversation with people I admire, whose work I've been following. And so I'll start, again, I'll give very abbreviated introductions on who these folks are. The longer bio is in the program. But I'll start first with Josh Center, since you're from the oldest of the organizations. But I've had SGI as a member of both ICCR and Series, and we're very proud for the opportunities we have and the work we do with both organizations. But starting with you, Josh, you've got a long background, 25 years prior to coming to ICCR, working on behalf of and with vulnerable folks on the margins and the peripheries. And you know, when you think about some of the ways that maybe you can describe a little bit how you've seen the ways that ICCR has been evolving in the most recent part of those 52 years, and what are some of the signs of emerging trends that they're experiencing?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I mean, first of all, just in starting, a big thank you to SGI for inviting me to be here. It's a real honor. to be here on your 50th anniversary. So thank you for that. Yeah, ICCR, you know, I mean, you've heard a lot about ICCR's history, kind of starting really parallel with seventh generation. And you know, as pioneers in the field of shareholder engagement on environmental and social issues. And you know, now, of course, and as Tim talked about, the world of ESG, however it's defined, is huge. And ICCR is and its members are a smaller player within, but still, I think what has remained the same is the mission and vision and leading edge of ICCR members. So the membership has evolved, still at the core religious investors, but now you know, a large number of like-minded values-based investors, which is heartening. So we have many allies by our side, pension funds, socially responsible asset managers, endowments, and others. And I think so our membership has evolved, but I think where we are in the space has remained the same. And what really defines ICCR is the canary in the coal mine aspect of our work. The fact that we are bringing issues, cutting edge issues to companies. We're the first ones doing it. We're always pushing the envelope, and that our conversations with companies are really grounded in the impact of corporate practices on people and communities and the planet, and don't start with the conversation about company value. That's where they evolve as we're a coalition of institutional investors, but we're really rooted in our focusing companies on what is the impact of their practices on people and communities. And I think in that, and on the environment, I think in that ICCR has remained and seventh generation so consistent through the years. In terms of emerging issues, I mean, I could give a very lengthy list, and I'll try and be short so we can hear from others, but just to flag a few things maybe for our discussion. One is we're very committed to being a group of investors that works closely with stakeholder groups. And that's you know, built in our roots as a religious-based coalition. So we don't see ourselves as just investors talking to companies, but we see ourselves as working closely with people who are impacted by corporate practices, whether it's worker groups and labor, community-based organizations, civil society groups, and that's really a critical part of our DNA, what we do. And we're looking for ways to make that more meaningful and to deepen those engagements as we move forward, believing fundamentally that that's how we can really create change as an investor coalition. A second thing to flag is that we see the UN guiding principles on business and human rights is really a key framework for faith-based and values-based investors. That's a voluntary framework that's only less than 15 years old, but it's one that's getting you know, broad adoption, pick up by companies, particularly in Europe. But it's a set of standards that really starts with asking companies to look at the most salient human rights impacts in their operations and supply chain. So it's a conversation that starts with what are your impacts as a company on people and on the environment. And that's a really important framework for us as faith and values-based investors. So, you know, happy to talk about that later, but that's an important framework. One other thing is that working on talking to corporations about how they treat their workers has been a really important part of ICCR and SGI's work for many, many years, decades. But this is getting broader acceptance and uptake in the investor community. Part of this perhaps is related to COVID. Through COVID, it really was not difficult to make the case to companies and mainstream investors that the way that companies treat and interact with their workers is really material to the bottom line. And this transition has opened up a lot of really interesting engagement with companies on living wage, on paid sick leave, on freedom of association, and other issues that are really fundamental to how companies treat their workers. And finally, and I'll be brief on this because I know Bill is going to go into this at more depth, we're really trying to direct our members, as well as much larger institutional investors, to really think about the work they do, or we do in engagement from a systemic lens. What I mean by that is we're always trying to talk to companies about, you know, if you have forced labor in your supply chains. Well, it's not good for your bottom line, reputational problems, financial problems, but really to make the case to companies that your externalities cause problems for society, even if you're making money in the short-term profit. And this has an impact on the bottom line of investors who are diversified investors holding, most of the market, if not all of the market. And so really try to drive this investor case for why we as investors care about systemic impacts by companies on climate, on inequality and other issues. And I'll leave that there because I know we're going to delve into this and stop.
Thanks, Josh. Now I'm going to turn to Reverend Kirsten Snow Spalding. She has, as you'll see in the program, a background that is quite encompassing. Everything from law and the practice of law, the teaching of that, to being chief of staff for a statewide elected public official and helping work within an organized labor. And in her spare time, also as a pastor of an Episcopal parish, Church of the Nativity in California. Series founded after the Exxon Valdez crisis, is in its fourth decade now. Why don't you talk a little bit about how you've seen the evolution of the work of your organization?
Thank you so much, Chris. It's like Josh, just such a privilege to be here with you. And I guess our beginning really building on the work of ICCR around the Exxon Valdez principles, looking for corporate social responsibility. Exxon had caused devastating environmental impacts, and we were the organization that was charged with implementing the principles and trying to enforce them with the largest companies to make sure that that kind of environmental devastation wouldn't happen again. Ceres has from its outset been a coalition of companies and a coalition of investors. In our start, we built on, as I said, the work of Seventh Generation and ICCR and began engaging investors, engaging companies to try and make change. I think when we started, we thought about values in a very fundamental way. We thought about proxy votes and the global warming shareholder campaign, which we co-convened with ICCR, I think in the early days, really focused on getting those companies to move on environmental issues. But like you've heard from other panelists, we began to address the sanctions and divestment movement in South Africa. We worked on tobacco with others, and practices in the investment community began to shift from a narrow focus on proxy votes to much more comprehensive engagements on a wide variety of issues that really addressed investors' values and true value, real economy value for those companies. So we moved, I would say, from the vote to ESG integration. Tim gave you the definition, environmental, social, and governance, but that these issues being understood as material financial risks to companies. And so investors began to think about how in every aspect of their business, when they were buying companies, when they were selling them, when they were deciding how to engage the companies in the portfolios, in every aspect of their work, they had to consider these factors as material financial issues for the companies. We started by thinking about those issues company by company. Does this issue matter to Exxon? Does this issue matter to GE or GM? And now I think, as Josh was pointing, we think more systemic, not just how does this impact one company, but how does it impact the economy overall? And as Josh pointed out, that idea of systemic risk. We care not only about whether or not this company is going to be harmed by an issue, but we care also about the impact this company is going to have on the whole economy and therefore on the whole of an investor's portfolio. So the investors I work with are really a mix of those who are rooted in faith, who really understand the values. And you may ask me a question later, but I think about us as building God's economy, not the economy, not the capitalist economy that we live in, but we're working towards God's economy, a very different model. I also think that in my network, I have those who are very strictly focused on risk and opportunity. And I can hold those different kinds of investors together because we are focused on creating real value in the economy. And I think that's the direction we're moving.
Thank you, Kirsten. And now my opportunity to introduce Bill Burkhardt. And Bill's with TIP. I was one of those ones who was recipient of some of the invitations by Josh and others to begin looking at systemic stewardship and some of the importance of that, which meant that I increasingly have had to read your work.
We often use 100 words for 2 books.
And attend some of the webinars and the like. For me, it's a real privilege finally to get to sit next to you and to have met you. We've heard a little bit about the evolution of social responsible investing and ESG. And why don't you tell us a little bit of how you see TIP fitting into that and kind of where we're going?
Yeah, sure. So just also want to thank everybody for including me here, Cynthia in particular. So TIP was started out of just a shared frustration. Both myself and my business partner, Steve Leidenberg, who some of you might know of, and some of his work in the responsible investment industry, we were pissed off. That's the best way to describe it. So I was coming at it from an impact investment perspective, and Steve was coming at it from the kind of public market ESG integration. And both of us were coming to this conclusion where, are we just navel gazing? Are we ultimately telling really positive portfolio stories, or are we driving true systemic transformation? Steve will often reflect on this fact of like, can we truly fulfill the promise of sustainable investing? And as it's currently practiced, it gets us part of the way there, but it doesn't get us all the way there. And that's really what TIP is about. It's this idea of system level investing where you're thinking both as an economist, but also as an ecologist. And you're trying to see, and I was looking at your intro letter and I was like, these are all perfect key themes. One, that financial decisions shape the world and they shape us, right? Feedback loops. We always thought everything that happened outside of our portfolios, these big systemic risks, these externalities, are beyond our control, right? But in reality, they are within our control if we act collectively. You talk about the whole thing about executive comp. We've done a lot of work on income inequality. That's an issue that we see as fundamental, of the same importance as climate change, because it is having that same kind of level of degradation and impact. And when we wrote a report in 2018, basically saying, and if we don't get serious about this in 30 years, this is going to be as significant as climate change. And then the pandemic happened, right? But there's all these other things where you talk about all the different issues. And what basically with the whole idea here is to say the issues we've been grappling with are of a different magnitude now. They're growing increasingly complex. They're growing increasingly interconnected. And our current tools, the way that we were practicing things, are no longer up to the challenge of dealing with these really complex, big systemic risks. And so the whole idea behind system level investing is, how do you elevate? If you think about the history of investment, right? It was about picking stocks, then in modern portfolio theory, now we're going to focus on a basket of stocks. And now what we're thinking about is thinking about the context of those companies, context of those opportunities. How do you make sure that you are increasing the stability and reliability of the various systems, the social, economic, and environmental systems that we all rely on for not just long-term performance, but global prosperity? And so that's really what TIP is about.
That is a really excellent summary. I'll turn back to Josh. I think that for many of us coming from faith traditions, we're accustomed to preaching in a certain way and trying to grow the flock. And so, like, when you see some of the unfinished work of bringing in and persuading others to the importance of the kind of commitments that we see as essential, how do we move other asset managers, other asset owners, how do we persuade them to kind of adopt a bit of our view of the world?
Yeah, it's not an easy task, and we have a lot of work to do there. Even amongst religious investors, we're a small community, those that are really focused on using assets to change the world, and even to, even with lesser ambition, to ensure that assets are not doing damage in the world, which is the very least that religious or any investors really should be looking at. I think, you know, our big task is moving the big asset managers. That's the big challenge of our time. You know, there's a lot of asset owners, public pension funds that are pretty, you know, moving along the curve on these issues, but the big asset managers, you know, Tim talked about this in his talk, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and the rest control a huge portion of companies, and they have a huge amount of influence. And as Tim pointed out, their proxy voting, it had been getting better and better and better over the last few years, really peaking in 2021, but it's taken a real turn down. Their support for resolutions that are looking at climate risk and DEI and corporate political spending and other really fundamental systemic risks, and that's a big problem, and that's where we really need to focus. You know, one thing that we've been talking about this panel, you know, one theme obviously that's emerging is really the need to focus investors on system-wide risks. And the big asset managers own the market. Their investments are in the whole market. There is no reason why they should be talking to companies about, you know, company A value, company A's long-term value, company B's long-term value, when that company is engaging in externalities that really cause stresses on the system, whether it's, you know, polluting the environment, greenhouse gas emissions, paying workers a sub-living wage, tax evasion, gouging on drug prices. You could go on so many of the issues that all of our members work on. And those big asset managers really should be focusing on those systemic risks, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because that's what's going to ensure the long-term value of that portfolio. So there's such a powerful fiduciary case for aligning asset managers with the issues that we care about, but we're not getting there. So that's, I think, the huge challenge that we face.
Thanks, Josh. Kirsten, some here have background in community organizing, not unlike you. And one of the principles I heard in training in community organizing is you've got to be able to look at two things. One, the world as it is, and then the other, the world as it should be, or the world as God created it to be, right? And maybe you could talk a little bit about like how we construct portfolios that align with our values, and how do we move into this world that God envisions.
I loved in your opening comments, Father Dan, about what Mike said about how this was really about creating justice and walking the gospel. And I think that is the question. How does portfolio construction relate to walking the gospel? People don't talk about that very often. But I really do think that we've moved from screening out the worst companies. And so we might have a pure portfolio, but those assets are bought by somebody else. So we haven't really impacted the long-term change, to the deep engagement work that SGI and so many have led in this room, the people who've been trying to transform the companies along the way. So these ideas, I think, for me, kind of come in two different directions. There are some who say, well, I want a pure portfolio. I want to construct a portfolio that reflects my values, and I'm going to lead by showing that it's possible to create good retirement income for our beneficiaries or good returns for our endowment at the same time as I live by really high standards. And then there are others who say, well, I'm trying to create an economy that is sustainable. This is God's economy, an economy that is in balance. And I'm going to own everything in the portfolio, but I've got to work with those companies that I hold, whether I hold their debt or whether I hold their shares or hold them in the private markets. I'm going to work with those companies to try and transform them so that the whole economy will look the way that we believe it should. So I think there's two directions, but both in the long run create real value. And that's what we need.
Thank you. Bill, you say from time to time, the majority of returns are from beta, not alpha, which sometimes contradicts what you hear in a lot of other places, or at least a lot of common advice. Why don't you explain what that means and how that fits into systemic stewardship?
Yeah, so I would encourage everyone to check out the work of John McCormick and James Hawley, who wrote a book called Moving Beyond Modern Portfolio Theory, if you want to go really into this. But the basic idea, and a lot of the studies that they point to, is that the variation an investor can expect in their returns, 70 to 90% of that variation is due to the health of the economy, not from individual stock picking. So it's really, when you think about the externalities that are being pushed onto society, it's chipping away at that beta. And so the whole idea behind systematic investing is really to say, okay, how do we start to actually shore up that beta so that as a rising tide is created and everyone succeeds, not just investors, but also everyone, right? That there is shared prosperity. And we think that's really important. A lot of the work that we've been doing has been trying to distinguish between what we mean by if someone's taking a portfolio level sustainable or impact approach versus a system level that's focused on that building of the beta. And so what we were able to identify was that there's this continuum of approaches. And that continuum of approaches, it was a lot of things that Tim was highlighting. You know, it's about, you're not just, you're still allocating assets. Sure, you're still updating policies, programs, practices to take this kind of orientation, but you're also thinking about the data infrastructure. So say we want to tackle human rights as good institutional investors. Is the actual data there that's going to be decision useful across the value chain that's going to get us there? Are we truly interrogating the belief systems that are underpinning these big systemic risks? So in the case of, say, gender balance or LGBTQ plus rights, there's flawed belief there is the belief that a monoculture is most efficient at allocation of assets and prosperity. If you think of income inequality, it's the shareholder primacy. And it's the idea that neoliberal thought that translates into we're gonna preference the shareholders at the cost of everybody else. And so when you start to get into that, you start to see how the solutions are not just asset allocation solutions. There are a lot of what you guys have all been pioneering. And so you're thinking about how do you inform policy? How do you set the rules of the game? How do you make sure that the data infrastructure, how do you create the ICCRs and the organizing bodies that are going to get investors to drive common awareness and collective action? These are all those things. And so when we talk about the spectrum of approaches that get to that beta thing, it's talking about how do we change how investors collaborate, which is inherently a very competitive industry. How do we change the way they invest? And then ultimately, how do we change what they're investing in? If you get all those right, then you start to get to the building of beta. I'll pause there.
Okay. Typically, most resolutions are one of two types. They're either asking for like a report or disclosure of things, and the other set is kind of a much more directed toward practice. And both of those efforts on the part of shareholders from Sirius and from ICCR have engendered a backlash these days. So I guess I'd like to ask both Kirsten and Josh if you'd speak a little bit about some of the disclosures that you think we need, but also in that context of this backlash that we're experiencing.
You want to go ahead?
When series started, I think almost always the disclosures that we asked for were sustainability reports. We just wanted to know what the company was doing, and we were happy if they sent us a glossy, pamphlet that said, here's what we're doing on sustainability. I think investors have gotten a lot more sophisticated now, and because they're really looking at those risks and looking for opportunities, they want metrics. They want things that are verifiable. They want to know how the company is not only being impacted by climate change or water risk or human rights or any of the issues that they're concerned about, but they also want to know how the company is impacting the whole economy. So I think looking for both the inputs and the outputs is really important in the disclosure. The last thing I would say is that I think in my experience over the last couple of years, we've gone from asking, what did you do last year? Tell us, how much did you emit in 23? How much did you emit in 22? So we can see the trend. But now we're asking forward-looking questions. What is your plan to address climate change? What is your plan to address your supply chain? or things like that. And those plans are now becoming much more robust, and investors are getting sophisticated about evaluating those plans and seeing where they're going. In climate in particular, I think we're also recognizing that we're not going to address the systemic risk of climate change without alignment. Investors, companies, cities, governments, individuals, we all have to move very quickly, reducing emissions to keep global warming at well below 1.5 degrees on a very, very short timeline. So more and more, I think investors are asking companies, are you aligned with a well below 1.5 degree scenario? And that's a new disclosure request.
Thank you.
And maybe on the backlash side of that question, you know, without addressing the political psychosis of this country, please do. One couple things to highlight without going there. And Tim touched on a lot of sort of the larger environment that we're facing right now, but fundamentally there's an issue in this country, and I'm not telling people anything they don't know, with money in politics and with the way that corporations are gaming the system with their heavy lobbying, and it presents real threats to systemic risks, as we're talking about, you know, threats to democracy, cynicism about the political process, policy making that favors the short-term corporate interests over long-term public interests, which is why it's so difficult to really get positive policy done at the federal level, state level as well. So, you know, one of the key investor focuses with ICCR and SGI and other investor series and others is on corporate political responsibility, is on pushing companies to align their corporate political activity with their stated core values. So that includes their election spending, who they're giving money to, including what political associations they're giving money to, and whether those political associations are undermining positions on climate change or respect for democracy or so many other issues that companies profess to care about, or whether that money is being used to lobby heavily, often through trade associations, on issues that are contrary to what the companies claim. You know, if companies say, well, we believe in we're setting net zero targets and we signed on a Paris Agreement, but then they're funneling money into trade associations that are lobbying against sound climate policy, to really push companies to take some accountability for that and to ensure that that their corporate political activity is aligned with their core values. That's a really important project for all of us. It's a difficult one, but we see that as really critical to really trying to align public policy with what we're trying to do. And the last thing I would say is just we're facing specifically a lot of threats to the shareholder proposal process and 14A8, which are the rules around filing shareholder resolutions. And I think increasingly what we're going to see is legislation in Congress that is going to try and undo that. We're facing a lawsuit from National Association of Manufacturers that would make that process unconstitutional under corporate First Amendment rights. And we're facing different activities, regulatory challenges and other activities that are legal challenges to regulations that the SEC is going to put out. So just to flag that as an area of concern and something that we're going to be reaching out to all of you about for help.
When you put it that way, it causes a certain amount of anguish in my stomach, but I know we've got good support in tackling these challenges for you.
We all need to be working together on this stuff.
Exactly. Bill, you've talked a bit about in other instances about some of the promise of SRI and ESG investing and how systemic stewardship can move us toward that. How do you think we get it from where we are to that promise? So why don't you describe that promise a little bit and how we get there?
Yeah, so it's helpful to think of when you think of tackling systemic issues, right? So I'm just going to go down the funnel. So you have big systems. Big systems are composed of multiple sectors. Sectors are composed of multiple industries. Industries are composed of multiple portfolios of companies, and then portfolios are composed of multiple companies. So when you start to think about the thread that gets you through to that systemic issue to start to enable that vision of God's economy, let's do an illustration. So you have something like mining disasters, right? So we all know the examples, Vale mining disaster, labor workers' rights are under threat. Okay, so number of investors get together to engage Vale and increase standards, make them more safe. Then they decide, well, actually, this is a problem across the entire industry. So now we're going to try to set standards and we're going to try to influence policy. We're going to try to do a lot of things that create more transparency and safety. And that's great. And that starts to change the industry. But a system thinker, a system level investor is going to say, right, but really what we're talking about is inequality. And we're talking about how labor workers' rights being under threat ultimately contributes to a lot of the degradation of the system, ultimately manifesting in social unrest and polarization of politics. You go down the list, right? So the system level investor is trying to connect those dots in anything that they're doing so they understand what that ultimate goal is. There are a couple, the way that we get there is we start pointing to those that are doing it, right? I would point folks to something like The Future of Investor Engagement. If anybody read that piece, it's by Jake Barnett of Westpath and Patrick Pure of Allianz. And it basically talks about, we need to change how engagement is practiced. We need to start thinking not just by company, we're thinking about entire sectors, entire value chains. We're thinking about engaging managers and we're thinking about policy. That's new, right? Like to put that all, you guys have been doing it in different parts, but like they've articulated it as a framework. Okay, that's great. Or it's something like, staying on shareholder engagement, it's something like university pension plan. So jointly sponsored pension plan in Canada, a bunch of university endowments. So they come together and they basically are looking at, we highlighted Climate Action 100+. Okay, awesome, except that only 6 Canadian companies met the threshold for engagement. So what UPP did was they said, okay, we're going to create our own version of it, composed of and targeting Canadian companies. I forget what the name of it is.
Shareholder engagement, Canada.
Something like that, Canada shareholder.
Climate Action Canada.
Yeah. But at any rate, it's thinking about, it's like almost looking at, we talk about the system goals, right? And then there's these 4 characteristics that cut across every system. So how adaptable is that system to shocks? So what are the things that we could be doing that are going to make it a more adaptable system? The problem with climate change is that we're so overly reliant on fossil fuels. We can't pivot to a diversity of energy sources. So we have to reform the energy system in the world. With income inequality, yet again, it's that lack of connectivity. That's another key dimension. So it's the connectivity amongst the key players and understanding how one thing is influencing another. And so when you do things like tax avoidance as a company, or tax deferment, you're now depriving the public sector of the resources needed to actually create the operating environment that's going to stabilize for your companies to thrive, right? So it's like you have to keep doing that and have to keep coming back to these characteristics of these systems and then start thinking through, okay, well, how are the tactics that I'm doing? How are the policies that I'm putting in place ultimately helping to ensure that it's becoming more adaptable, that there's greater clarity of the system, that the rules of the game, the directionality of the system are catching up. It's all of that. So it's really easy. I mean,
We'll be ready next week.
Yeah.
Then one final question I'll offer you, then we'll go to some Q&A. If we were to imagine Tim back in 1971 asking, thinking to himself, what's ICCR going to be like in 2021? I'm going to ask you, Paul, we're sitting in 2023. What do you think will be the evolution of socially responsible investing, ESG investing, over maybe 50 years, but let's see what you say the near future. 10 years. 10 years.
I would say the kind of collaboration that you have led and that ICCR and series are committed to, the kind of systemic thinking that Bill's talking about, I think all of those are going to be part of our future. I don't think we can do this one investor at a time, one company at a time. I really do think we have to work together. So I think more collaboration is going to be critical. I think the tools that we've used, dialogues, votes, portfolio construction, I think those are going to evolve. and that we're going to see a different kind of approach to real value creation that's going to go beyond the confines of our portfolio. So as Josh signaled, working with policymakers, thinking about alignment, really getting close to the communities that matter, and staying in touch with the rest of the planet, not just the humans.
Yeah, I mean, I think, taking that glass half full, because we've been talking so much about all of the issues, challenges we're facing. I mean, I think maybe one of the good things, if there are good things about this whole anti-ESG campaign that Tim laid out, is that it's forcing us to really sharpen our strategies and sharpen our way of looking at our arguments and really persuading people and moving things. So, one of the problems with ESG, ICCR is never really an ESG organization, because ESG is really about looking at company value. And obviously we're a coalition of investors, that matters. But what binds us is that we are, is our concern for people and planet. And so we now have to talk about ESG in a way that is going to persuade more than the already persuaded. We need to bring the public along. We need to bring other institutional investors along. And I think that really is in talking about some of the themes on this panel, and what Kirsten laid out around. This is really about systems risk, and that's a fiduciary argument. And it's also an argument about how we as a people care about our society going forward, that is aligned with the fiduciary argument. So I think in our responses to this anti-ESG push, I think it's going to make us stronger. And it's going to enable us to build the movement along with civil society groups, along with investors that really understand that we need to push companies on their externalities, on corporate practices that are really causing risk to systems. And I think we build strength that way. That's the optimistic view, and there's going to be a lot of bumps along the way, but I think that's where we're going and hopefully can get.
So I guess going back to the fiduciary thing, what we're fundamentally talking about with systemic risks are intergenerational risks, right? We were dealing with them 50 years ago, they're evolving, they're going to continue to evolve over the next 50 years. Where what I think is possible and what I'd like to see happen more is there's the practical side of it, right? So there's the practical side where what if we compose indexes of what a system needs, not of the best performers and certain characteristics, right? What if you had an entire, like CFA Institute apparently is now acknowledging system level investment in the curriculum. So getting trained so that you have a next generation of financial professionals that actually care about this and actually can know how to manage this. Having a regulatory environment that truly does catch up to this, you're starting to see it, particularly in Europe, and hopefully that's going to inspire others so that 50 years from now, we're not going to be, I was going to say something colorful, but I'm remembering I'm in a religious institution. It just wasn't true. But yeah, and then I think the fundamentally it's around that belief system, right? And if you think of systems dynamics and you think of the ways that systems truly fundamentally change, it always comes back ultimately to the culture and to the belief system that is guiding the community. And so I think everything that we're doing, these intergenerational risks that require these different kinds of solutions, this requires this different way of operating. I think we have the roadmap. And I think now the challenge is just how do we make sure that it comes to life? And in 50 years from now, somebody's going to come up with like, I don't know, the tactical system level investing or whatever the next blended system level investment, whatever it is, but that next thing. And then we can debate about that. And I'll be the old guy up there going, being like, all right, you kids, we tried that. Here's why it didn't work. Sorry, dude.
I'd like to, Valley flashed me a sign a little while ago saying that we're actually ahead of schedule from here. But I'd like to inquire about your questions. And if you're visiting us from online, you can also type those in the chat and we can get those brought to us from Neil and from Natalie. So if somebody's got a question, yeah.
Hi, y'all shared some really great perspectives. I can't wait to dig into the roots of the emotional side. Like really excited. And the concept of God's economy is very powerful. I'm very excited to dig into that. We've talked a lot, I've heard a lot about shareholder activism tonight. I wanted to get your perspectives on the role of employee ownership and achieving the alignment that we're talking about today.
It's a great question.
I mean, I think it's where we should be going. It's, fundamentally, in terms of empowering workers and worker rights, it's a model that investors should really be pointing to in terms of support, in terms of building long-term value of companies. We're a long way off of that. There's a robust movement there. But at the end of the day, if the argument is that a committed workforce is a key to long-term value for the company, there's no stronger way to build a committed workforce than through employee ownership, whether it's worker cooperatives or ESOPs or other vehicles. So I think it will hopefully be a direction that we're going to. There's a long way to go, but I think fundamentally a model that is going to build long-term value and that should be really something that should be attractive to capital. I don't know. Others want to.
I would absolutely agree with your answer, Josh. And I would say we've got some small experiments that are working well, that are creating real value. I think this is a place where our concerns about the labor movement and the workforce really intersect. So giving workers a voice at work is a starting place to giving them an ownership share in the businesses, so that when they thrive, they're really benefiting both the people that are in the workforce, the communities where those businesses are based, and the shareholders who ultimately are putting their deferred wages. Shareholders really often is retirement funds. So those retirement funds are the wages that then get invested back in the economy. And so thinking that way from a worker perspective about how we grow God's economy, I think is really important.
One thing I would just add there too, just broaden the aperture a little bit, so it is about employee ownership. That's huge, right? If we're going to talk about inequality, we can't not do that, right? And that's fundamental. But we also have to think about what is the actual utility of certain kinds of capital. So if you think about public equities, great for driving kind of evolutionary transparency across major companies. Think of fixed income, particularly when it's a security by a government, right? It creates public goods. Venture capital, great for driving disruptive, revolutionary change. So thinking about that, and so I think in this case, when we're talking about, well, how do we start to reach not just workers everywhere down the value chain, but how do we really try to start to address the issues around inequality? Because that's fundamentally what we're talking about. Well, if you think of, I wear another hat where we invest in LGBTQ plus led ventures. And that's a mechanism to address this issue in venture capital where less than 1%, it's actually 0.07% of venture capital goes to LGBTQ plus led ventures. You think of this atmosphere right now in the US, it's record bills that are anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ generally. That's huge. And you think about how much venture capital culturally now goes to women-led ventures, that goes to like we just did bodywork on racial inequity. Same thing there, right? So the moment you add intersectionality, that's a big thing. That's a big driver of inequality. And so I would just say employee ownership is a massive part of it, but you also have to think about, but like business creation and enterprise value, like all of these things start to come together. You have to think about all of those different layers.
Maybe I'll add one other little piece as moderator's prerogative. I think one of the gifts of SGI is that we bring together members who are in their own way trying to work through these questions. And as you said, the canary in the coal mine, sometimes the first to raise those questions. Inside the Catholic world, there's a movement, the Economy of Francesco, and a number of our members have been very involved in that. I'm not sure where Sister Sue Ernster is seated right now. There she is. She's been at the very forefront of that and taking some particular action in her community, the FSPAs. But some of the others here, including an asset manager, have been through through a workshop that the Francesco Collaborative has done. And so I think that finding opportunities to talk about those practices and how we move helps us get from here to there too. I hope that's helpful for the question you raised. Other questions?
Bill, what is the name of the book that you mentioned? That we can go back to that.
Yeah, so there's two books I would encourage. So the first is Moving Beyond Modern Portfolio Theory. So that is really explains why. Why should we move from a portfolio focus to a systemic one in terms of dealing with these issues? And these came out at the same time, but they also kind of funded us. So then the other book is 21st Century Investing, Redirecting Financial Strategies to Drive Systems Change. That was the book I wrote with Steve Leidenberg. And so that gives you the how. So moving beyond modern portfolio theory is the why, 21st century investing is the how.
And then modern portfolio theory, economists created that, won the Nobel Prize in economics. Either John or maybe you or somebody else will get one in the near future. Another question.
I want to thank you all as panelists. Run off a little bit with what William shared. I think you got me thinking here a little bit, wondering, so a big part of the movement with life years ago, from the stories of the Sisters of St. Joseph, is there was this whole controversy of how in the world can we invest in a tobacco company? We were being told for years, divest from the same stock. And yet, if you really think about the areas, we need to flip this whole thing on the head, and we as religious communities need to be talking about, we need to reinvest in all the same stocks to make changes, whether it's arms, whether it's tobacco, whether it's, I mean, all the same stock areas that we pulled out of. I mean, I don't know how that's going to go over in the larger, let's just call it religious communities, but isn't that maybe what you were asking us, William?
Yeah.
Maybe about areas, let's go back to the sin stock and let's religious communities. You see the headlines in all our Catholic papers. I don't know. Just wondering.
So there's two dimensions to it. So one is just the moral values perspective, right? And there's just certain industries, certain sectors that some people just like, I don't trust crypto. I'm not going anywhere near it, right? But everybody has their thing, and there's sin stocks, we're labeled sin stocks for a reason. But fundamentally, when you're thinking about how do you drive that bigger change, and if the goal with avoidance of divestment, if the goal was it's going to change the cost of capital for those companies, that has proven that doesn't work. So and there's plenty of empirical evidence that backs that up. So it's just that question of saying, right, okay, if we're not going to win on that front, that we can't eliminate that tool is a good tool, but we can't win completely on that. So what are the other things that we can start doing? And so when you think about these big companies that just are disproportionately big in the market, they're bellwether for different reasons, and changing their business models. So this goes back to that where I said changing how investors collaborate, changing how they invest, and changing what they invest in. This is the opportunity. So it's saying, can I start to influence, engage this company so they adopt more circular economy principles? So moving from kind of take, dispose to regenerative by design, right? And it's qualities like that that you want to start to see brought into exactly that, this toolkit that we now need to consider. And it does mean we have to reevaluate how we've been using certain of our tactics.
Yeah, I would just add, there's been a big sort of conversation in the climate space around divestment versus engagement. I think it's not an either or. There is a value, as Bill said, it may not change the share price, but there's an important symbolic value to divestment, especially, say in fossil fuels. But it's also critical for people to be engaging with the fossil fuel companies and ICCR members and SGI. Father Mike was, out front engaging with Exxon through all these years and really had a powerful impact there. So there really is an important role for engagement, and it's, it's a choice for investors as to whether they want to take that step. The only other thing I would say is that, most portfolios, there aren't too many companies in there that don't have issues, whether it's labor issues and supply chain or operation, whether it's, it could be any number of issues around climate or environment or pollution or political spending. And so if you're going to be an investor holding public equities, it's critical to look at your portfolio and think, how can I make a difference in engagement? If I'm going to hold these shares, there's very few companies in my portfolio that really don't have issues that are having a negative impact on society. It's just the nature of our corporate system, and how can I engage in a meaningful way? And so I think that's been an important basis for all of our collective work for so many years. Sometimes it involves owning shares that might be distasteful, but if there's a purpose and a meaning to owning them, then there's an importance there. The last thing I would say is that some of our members, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, will own just enough stock to engage with companies, and that's a tactic that many use.
I think that many of the investors I work with ask the question, what's the future of this company? And so I was working today with my church's corporate social responsibility committee on a gun manufacturer. So given the violence and the gun violence here in the United States today, how can we hold a gun manufacturing company? And I think we've reached the conclusion that gun manufacturer has a role to play in making guns safer, in making sure that there are permitting and disclosure rules around those guns so that there will be more protection for families, for communities, for children in particular. There's no reason for assault weapons. There could be still a different business model that might allow for guns for hunting that wouldn't be used in the kinds of mass shootings that we've seen. So there's this kind of fine conversation about, well, what could this company be that would still create value and might not be so bad? And I agree with Josh. In some cases, we may say, we don't want to be the one that holds them. They just don't align with our values.
The other thing, I guess the other layer I would say to it is the acknowledgement that this is not going to change overnight. And fundamentally, for companies to do what they're doing, there is some extractive behavior to it. And so the real key here is finding that balance between value extraction and value preservation. That's the lane that a lot of these companies are going to have to navigate through as you try to get them to become that company of the future.
This has been really great. I've loved this conversation. I think we've gone to a lot of places and issues and themes, and looking both in the past and into the future. Let's give a round of applause, please. I think for many of you, I think we've just gone through, for a fair number of us, perhaps the first meeting we've been to that Frank Sherman hasn't asked a question. I'd like to invite Frank forward to present the Father Mike Crosby Award. So I'm at least making sure he gets in a word.
But why would I tell no lights? Dan, you want to come join me? So now I've been given the distinct honor of presenting the Father Mike Crosby Award to my colleague and dear friend, Dan Tretow. Now, it's only been a year since we've been up on this stage, Dan, in in different roles, when I received this distinguished award. That was, feels like many moons ago, and, about a dozen or so grandchildren birthdays. But truth be told, that Dan was really nominated for last year's award. And it was Dan that refused it and said, put my name forward. And that's how I got the award last year. But this is typical Dan, isn't it? It really is. So allow me to digress for a few minutes. You've heard the story about 50 years ago when two local school sisters, St. Francis, met with a young Capuchin priest who admitted to me he was a lousy pastor, so he had to find something else to do. So Mike Crosby, Sister Alfonso, and Sister Shalom worked together to create something that better aligned their financial assets with their mission. So they didn't go into this wanting to change corporate America. They went into it because they felt something was wrong, where they were working so hard on certain social issues and care creation, yet their investment side was investing in companies that were really destroying those things. So from that, and from these pioneers, what later became socially responsible investing, ESG investing, they really had no idea what this one brave act was really going to impact in terms of corporate America. And I guess, you know, the earlier comments from our distinguished panels, and our warning from our executive director saying, be careful what you say, what you write these days, because you never know. But I'll say, you know, our capitalistic system is not quite woke. Okay, but because of you in this room, it's starting to awaken. And you can tweet or X me on that, I don't care. So I'm sure that Sister Shalida is smiling today. And Sister Alfonso is also smiling to see that one of their own now is being recognized with this annual legacy. Now, Dan is the director of financial services for the School Sisters of St. Francis Generally. He's been involved with SGI for almost as long as it started, becoming member representatives, School Sisters, in the early 1980s, about the time I was entering elementary school. And he's been engaged in corporations on social and environmental issues such as worker rights, executive pay, supply chain sustainability, climate change, among others. I've sat with him at Coles, at WEC, our local utility, Madison Gas, Electric, another utility in Wisconsin. And Dan has the patience and kind of the fortitude, the faith comes through in those conversations as he challenges to do better. Now, Dan was a member of our first board in 2015 as treasurer, and he stepped up again in 2018 to become our president. And I came to rely on Dan for his experience, his financial knowledge, and his patience with me. But I think it was his deep faith and his warm friendship that I appreciated the most. He was instrumental in repositioning our coalition from a founder-driven, we all know that founder was driven, to a member-led organization that it is today. Now, Brother Mike will also be smiling today. He is smiling and very proud to join his other co-founders in congratulating Dan on receiving this award that represents this thing. So you'll join me in congratulating my friend and Tretow as I present him the 2023 Father Mike Crosby Legacy Award.
I'm glad you all had a chance to stand up. It was really difficult to stay seated for so long. I am so grateful and honored to accept the Father Mike Crosby Award. And I do this on behalf of the School Sisters of St. Francis. The legacy of School Sisters of St. Francis involvement in this movement began 50 years ago with the three founders that you heard about. Sister Charlita, Sister Alfonso, and Mike. They would be quick to say it was a meeting of like minds and mission. They understood three religions do not constitute a movement. And their first task would be, who else can we invite to join us? You heard me say earlier that in 1973, there were 7 congregations that came together. And less than a year later, there was 18 that were joining the coalition. The Wisconsin congregation they contacted was eager to respond yes to the call for corporate responsibility and action. The first edition of 7th Generation Interfaith was born in 1973, and it was called Corporate Responsibility Action Group. The Wisconsin Coalition was the first Catholic coalition to join Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility that same year. I want to embrace Father Mike's statement taken from ICCR's In Memoriam video clips titled Mike Crosby in His Own Words. Mike said, "It really is the great commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. All I know is that the founder of my religion, Jesus, says that what we do to the least, we do to him. And I do not want to continue people being crucified and the planet being crucified. So I can work with my province, and my province can use me to bring good news to the poor and the planet. That is my mission." 50 years is a milestone to be proud of. It shows how resilient and relevant an organization must be to exist this long. In our history, we have only had 3 directors. Father Mike led for 41 years, Frank Sherman for 7, and now Chris Cox for the past 2 years. 7th Generation Interfaith continues the mission started 50 years ago. Chris, Natalie, and Christina are here with and for us to help make the world a better place for people and the planet. I am grateful to the School Sisters of St. Francis for allowing me the opportunity to represent them, the SGI board and staff, and all of you that keep 7th Generation Interfaith relevant and growing. Our work is not done. I encourage all of you to take one more action step in the next 12 months that you did more than you did last year. And I just thought of this as I was sitting and listening to all of these people up here. The panels were excellent. But there's something I want to do in remembrance of Mike. And I want you to repeat after me. What I got out of Mike's paragraph in memoriam is use me. Use me. Use me. Use me. Use me. Use me. Thank you very much.
We'll get a photo with him afterward, because I'm now the last person standing between you and the beverages and food and everything else. So my primary word is a word of gratitude. Coming to this day, there's been a lot of work. I can only hint to you the work that Natalie and Christina have done, and I Neil, his technical expertise helping us out. Grateful for our hospitality at St. Francis. Grateful for our sponsors and for folks who traveled so far to be with us tonight, share their experience, their wisdom, and their knowledge. And so very grateful for our members to make our work possible. It really is a blessing to be with you, and thank you. And with that, we'll say let's adjourn and conclude everything.